So welcome, everyone. Good evening. I'm Susan Earle. I'm really thrilled to be here with you this evening. I'm the curator of this exhibition that we are sitting in, The Power of Place, KU Alumni Artists. We are so delighted to have 7 artists in the exhibition here to speak about their work this evening. I want to also mention that there are other artists whose work is in the exhibition. There are 30 living artists in this exhibition. Sue Ashline, would you mind just raising your hand? And G. Mitchell. So, did I miss anyone else whose work is in the show who's not speaking? What I thought we would do is so David Cateforis, art history professor, and I are going to co-moderate the panel. And I thought I would introduce the speakers, then they will speak. Each for a few minutes. We will have images of their work shown here, their exhibited works, and sometimes a few others. And then we would have a question and answer and discussion after they've each had a chance to speak. I do want to thank the Franklin D. Murphy Lecture Fund from the Crest Foundation Department of Art History. That fund that brings artists to campus has provided the support for this artist panel this evening. So we're going to go alphabetically and start with David Brackett. David Brackett's work explores the effects of chance on the formation of pattern, both in nature and in society. Born in Detroit, Michigan, he received a Bachelor of Science degree in zoology from the University of Michigan. With 2 artist parents, he then shifted directions and earned a Master of Fine Arts in textiles from the University of Kansas. His work has been exhibited nationally and internationally at venues such as the Lancaster Museum of Art, the Yeiser Art Center, the Rice Gallery, at the Albany Institute of Art History, the Society of Arts and Crafts, and Kyoto City Museum. He has received many awards for his work and has taught numerous workshops on weaving, dyeing, and screen printing. He is currently Associate Professor of Textiles and Fibers in the Visual Art Department here at KU. David Brackett.
Hi, can you hear me? Welcome everybody, thank you for coming. I fear my talk tonight is going to be like my work, where I'm just going to throw a bunch of stuff at you and hope that you can put it together to make some sense out of it. But as Susan mentioned, thank you, Susan, I got my degree in zoology, so I've always been very interested in science. I was not a great scientist, so I decided to pursue art as a career. The work that I produce I was attracted to weaving for my love of pattern and my love of color. So I've been studying particular types of patterns and how they are. And this is commonly referred to as chaos theory, where I hate to use that term because it implies something that it is not, but it's really that how things are not really random. There's some controlling factors, and patterns are produced even though there's an element of chance. So that element of chance makes that these patterns are not predictable and not constructible with a set formula, but they have a characteristic look. So things like the stripes on a tiger, or fingerprints, or bark on a tree, all have very characteristic look, and yet they're all unique every time you see them. So my work combines cloth into collages that I cut and sew together. And some of the cloth is produced on a hand loom in my studio, where I paint dyes and I do all of the dyeing prior to it being woven. And that cloth is combined with cloth that I design on a computer, and I go to mills in North Carolina. And that allows me to work with photographic images. So I can work with landscapes, and I can work with memories, and I can work with vacation images. And in a funny way, my work has come to be sort of like making a scrapbook, where each of my pieces is another page in my scrapbook, and I decide which images to include, how to arrange them, how to embellish them. And studying more about memory, I have learned that we risk altering our memories every time we revisit them. So by documenting these images and working with them, I am really probably changing them in my own mind and creating new memories. But in preparation for the show, I started thinking about memory and how we all tend to attach places to our memories. When we give stories, often you tell where you were when it happened, even if that information's not pertinent. This piece that's on the screen now, it looks a bit washed out. I did that piece about a dozen years ago, and it was a format that I had never used before, and something compelled me to do that particular arrangement. And it wasn't until it was done about 2 months later, and I was coming up with the title, I realized that growing up, I lived in a house on a hill above a lake, and that was the arrangement of my bedroom windows. And when you looked out the windows, all you could see were the tops of the trees because we were on the top of a hill. And I realized that I just recreated my high school bedroom. So I think we tend to attach place with our memories. 3 days ago, I was going to show a friend a photograph I had taken last December, and when I touched it, a map came up with a little pin saying Ann Arbor, Michigan, to tell me where it was taken. I didn't even know my phone could do that. So this must be important to a lot of people, that they want to know where the pictures were taken. And I think it's a way of us recalling memories, retaining memories, and we tend to group memories together. You know, if you think of a vacation you took, all of a sudden all the memories of that vacation come back to you. In the piece that I have in the show, there's one additional element in that the borders, the weaving I did by hand, it was a reference to film and the individual cells in a film, and how when you look from one cell to the next, not much changes, but when you watch a movie, the whole story comes forward. And I think weaving for me is analogous to the way that we live, that one row at a time, you pack it into place, and these memories, or the patterns, slowly build up. And the simple patterns reveal themselves right away. More complicated ones, sometimes it takes me a couple hours before I start to see something. And some patterns, I have to get up and walk away from the loom in order to see what's there, because when you're sitting in front of it, you can't. So the title of that piece, Point of View, was meant both literally and metaphorically as how things are perceived differently, how we think about them differently, depending on where we are when we see them and how we move around. I'm sure there was plenty more I was going to say. How long is that been? It seems like forever, but is that good? Oh, perfect. I'm done.
Thank you, David. So I'm sorry I forgot to mention earlier that this room is equipped with an audio looping system. So if that is helpful to anyone, we also do have headsets out in the lobby if anyone could use one. I'm sorry I didn't mention that before. So can people hear me okay? I know the acoustics are still not always. Is that right? So Marcie Miller Gross creates meditative works with materials that consider the vulnerability of the human condition, such as industrial felt, wood, wool sweaters, soil, and used hospital towels. She graduated from the University of Kansas with a BFA in design, after which she earned an MFA from Cranbrook Academy of Art in Michigan. She has received honors that include a Charlotte Street Foundation Fellowship, a Glogau AIR residency, and Open Studios in Berlin, Germany, with support from an Arts KC Inspiration Grant, a Studios Inc. residency from the Nicholson Foundation, an Allied Arts and Craftsmanship Award from the American Institute of Architects. Her recent projects include commissions for the Health Education Building at the University of Kansas Medical Center in Kansas City and the School of Business at the university here in Lawrence. Recent exhibitions include Pattern Languages at Rockhurst University, Every Street, Hawk Contemporary, and Linden Mid-America Arts Alliance in Kansas City, among others. Her work has been reviewed in national publications and is included in numerous public and private collections, and she is nationwide, and she is represented by Hawk Contemporary in Kansas City. Thank you. Marcie Miller Gross.
Thank you, Susan. I'm trying to figure out how loud I need to talk into this. So I think I need to begin with and start here in Lawrence and KU, and how my awareness of the built and natural environment, the significance of place, began with my studies in interiors and design and architecture and history of architecture and history of art, all here when I got my BFA. This foundation is really important to the way that I read space and understand the specifics of a site, its weight and atmosphere, its materiality, the spatial experience, and how that's all tied to my memory. All of these sort of feed into my working process and thinking process as an artist, and it's shifted and changed in varying degrees over the years of my studio practice. The wall sculpture in the exhibition is titled Beyond the Wall, and it evolved out of a body of work that from the past 2 years after I spent a 2-month residency in Berlin, where my focus was on the city and its many memorials and sites and sacred spaces and its rich sort of cultural and tragic history. Simultaneously, I found the trees a profound presence in that urban context. The trees buffer, envelop, and offer a looming protection, while also kind of standing as a witness to the city's ghosts. So this piece was based on a photograph that I took of one of the existing inner walls at the Berlin Wall Memorial that really sort of divided and held back this looming mass of dark trees within a cemetery. So I kept returning to that image, and it became really sort of the conceptual and compositional inspiration for the piece. The contemplative and sort of mysterious nature of that really deep green space parallels what I find really absorbing in the materiality of that sort of deep moss sheer plane of this piece. In an earlier series, just within the previous year, another site that I had visited often and photographed, again, that was in Berlin, was a small chapel at the Wall Memorial, in which the conditions of light illuminated the interior made of, actually the interior wall, which was made of rammed earth and rubble. And that image was really powerful to me and sort of sat in my view on my studio table for a couple of years before I quite knew what to do with it or what it meant to me. And it eventually fed into and informed the making of a floor sculpture based on the interior space of that chapel. So ultimately that sculpture and that photograph were presented and exhibited together. So for me, not really having ever used photographs in my work, and probably the last that I really looked very seriously at photography was when I took photography here at KU. Or I shouldn't say looked seriously, but took my own photographs seriously. So for me then, finding this and sort of finding the immediacy of taking a photograph and connecting with a specific moment and emotion, and how that contrasts with the really slow accumulative process of which I typically work, making three-dimensional objects in my studio, was a really interesting contrast for me. And I'm interested in the dialogue between my intuitive response at a site and the physical making of these objects, often much later. So it's this dynamic between object and image across a span of time, and sort of relying on my memory as well. So from the same series, I juxtaposed large floating images on film of landscape and woods and views through trees taken from a moving train, and put those in conjunction with or contrast to these elemental utilitarian forms on shelves. So this was an interesting interplay for me between a distilled moment, a feeling of being sort of hung between places, with the visual weight of these silent objects. So there's a curious slice of time that creates an altogether different sense of place within these works that continues to intrigue me. These were, sort of experiments of trying to bring things together that felt like they had some connection, but I didn't quite understand what that connection was. So I think at this point I will stop. And continue.
Thank you, Marcie. Lisa Grossman was born in rural Western Pennsylvania. She earned an associate's degree in visual communication at the Art Institute of Pittsburgh, and in 1988 moved to Kansas City to work as an illustrator at Hallmark Cards, Inc. She soon encountered the tallgrass prairie of the Flint Hills and began exploring and painting them. After 7 years at Hallmark, she quit to return to school, spending a year at Johnson County Community College, then transferring to KU in 1996 and setting up home in Lawrence with her wife, author Kelly Barth. She earned a BFA at KU and has made a career of painting and printmaking since her first solo show in 1998 at Dolphin Gallery, now Hawk Contemporary in Kansas City. Her Prairie and Kansas River work has appeared in 30 solo shows around the country, and over 1,600 of her works have found their way into private homes, corporations, schools, libraries, hospitals, museums, and one football stadium. She is an 8-time artist in residence in our national parks, including a 2017 Voices of the Wilderness Artist in Residency with the U.S. Forest Service Kayak Rangers in Tracy Arm Ford's Terror Wilderness in southeast Alaska. Man, I want to go there. Wow. She volunteers with local conservation groups and applies her work to their advocacy efforts. She is a river guide and also the secretary of Friends of the Caw, the only nonprofit dedicated to protecting and preserving the Kansas River. Lisa Grossman.
Thank you, Susan, and Sarah Lynn, and everyone here at the Spencer. I'm so grateful for all the support over the years, and for this show. It's a real honor to be included, and I've met so many great artists and reconnected with old friends, and it's been a pleasure to get to know your work. So time is short, I know. Briefly, my KU career, my favorite moments were in this building, I would say. So, the collections, the shows, and so many really great visiting artist lectures, the Art and Architecture Library. This is where I felt at home at KU, and especially my favorite art history classes with David Cateforis and Charles Eldridge. So it's a treat to be back here in this context. So we're supposed to talk about the work in the show, so I'm gonna dive right into my print panels piece in the way back there, if you have had a chance to see it. Am I loud enough? So back in 2004, Rick Mitchell here, then director of the Lawrence Arts Center, gave me my first show at the Art Center, and I decided to take the opportunity to experiment a little bit. I'd been showing in commercial art galleries, and I felt like I had freedom to try some things I'd wanted to try, and one of them was to focus on the river as my subject. And so that piece emerged out of that period of experimentation, and I wanted to experiment with some new materials and printmaking too, so the show included some little watercolors and oils and then the printmaking. So the piece is called 86 Bends of the Caw, and prior to that I'd done mostly plein air prairie work. So the river had been kind of germinating in my mind. I live here, it's practically in my backyard. I see it almost every day. I've explored the trails and biked the trails for over 20 years, I think, and it was in my mind, and then I got to see it from the air a couple times, once on a commercial flight and once on a flight with Gil Zemansky, one of my pilot friends who have taken me flying up and down the river. And so I just got a little bit of footage from it, and I asked Gil if he would take me flying again so I could see the entire thing. I said, I want to do the entire 173 miles of the Kansas River in one piece. So that piece was my first attempt to capture the whole length of the main stem of the caw in one piece. So I can explain, the technique is hard to explain. You can ask me later if you're really interested. It's essentially woodcuts. There's, I think, 48 different woodcuts in a relief roll process. There it is, sort of. And it was also my attempt to celebrate every part of the river, every facet of the river, including the less appealing, maybe urban industrial areas, the bridges and levees and roads, all that stuff is in there. And then in the next year, 2005, I did another 7-panel version that is in the collection of Michael Michaelis at Emprise Bank in Wichita. And then actually I did a third version in oils. I don't know if that has come up there yet, but this last fall I had a show at Hawk Contemporary, and let me know when it's up there. Oh, there, okay. That was at Hawk Contemporary in the fall, and that was my third attempt to do the entire river and 7 horizontal rows of small, they're actually kind of miniature painterly sequences of the river, and I've flown over the river at least a dozen times now, so there's a lot more information in the pieces as they every time I do them, power plants and everything. So the caw has really helped me deepen my connection to my place here. Lawrence is my chosen home, And like I said, I have a lot of contact with the Caw. I've paddled every mile of it, and the sandbars are, I think, the best way to experience really deep time in this place. I mean, the sandbars reveal the story of, millennia of fossils and bones and cultural artifacts, ancient and modern. So I'm passionate about the river, and I've worked with Friends of the Caw for a long time, but I've been on the board for 8 years, and through Friends of the Caw, I have contacted so many fabulous scientists, biologists, geologists, and educators, and lawyers who know the Clean Water Act. All of that goes into the work. So to conclude, I'm probably at 5 minutes here, but one of my goals is to bring this river into the consciousness of the community. I think most of us only see it, flying over one of the bridges, and so that's satisfying for me to to put it on the map visually and share its magnificence and its importance. We drink it every day, and along with 800,000 other Kansans, so cheers.
Thank you, Lisa. So Brian Hawkins is a multimedia artist who is often interested in memories and historical narrative and where they spill over into the realm of fiction. He received a BFA in studio art and art history from the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and went on to earn an MFA in printmaking here at the University of Kansas. He currently works in the photography studio as the photography studio coordinator and photographer for the Department of Visual Art at KU. He has exhibited his work internationally in venues including Wichita State University, the Anaheim Convention Center, and Propeller Center for the Visual Arts in Toronto, Canada. I want to also mention that when we had the Ann Hamilton and Cynthia Shira exhibition here, among the things that Brian did was he played amazing ragtime music on our Bechstein piano right over there that was curtained by Ann Hamilton. And we really enjoyed that, Brian. So, Brian Hawkins, thank you.
Well, thank you. I'm really happy to be here among all of these amazing artists. And as Susan has said, a lot of my work does sort of ruminate on memory and history, and I think that the reason that I'm sort of preoccupied with it is that, I don't know, like once the moment passes, then, we're always stuck in the present, and I feel at some point as though, as David mentioned earlier, as we remember things, our memories can fluctuate and change. Things become really unreliable, and history becomes then really unreliable if you start to think about that the way that we really kind of understand the world and our place in it is just assembled from what other people have told us, their experiences are, and these collections that sort of start to emerge of other people's experiences and then our own lived experiences, which are obviously prone to change through memory. So that is kind of where I tend to pace, I guess, in my work. And as a result of that, I mean, every memory that we have or every event that transpires in the world has a certain place where it has to occur. And so I think that's ultimately where, the power of place sort of starts to interact, I guess, more with the work that I make. Like, it's, so the pieces that are in the show specifically are all set in places that I'm very familiar with. One of the locations that has been photographed is the childhood home where I grew up, the land around the house where I grew up and where I live once again as an adult. And so I've spent 31, almost 32 years in that spot and have a good understanding of what that place is like. The other location that is on display here, strangely, is my studio. When I was a grad student, I made a stop-motion animation that depicts the studio in which it was made. It's no longer the place where I work in the Department of Visual Art, but it is now, every year turned over to another grad student who takes over that place and changes it to suit their own needs. And so between these two things, it has led me to think about the way that, as we spend more and more time in a place, it's almost as if there's this sort of fine dust that just is settling all the time around us. And the longer that we are in a place, the more of that dust sort of settles, and the heavier and more powerful it becomes, the more sort of pull it has over us. I think that the same thing can happen if something really traumatic happens in a certain location. Then, of course, that's sort of agitating that sort of, whatever that substance is that sort of lends a place its power. But these two places that I've depicted do hold a lot of sort of weight, I guess, within my life and the way that I've watched them change. And it made me think that, it's not really even interacting with these spaces that becomes important after so much time. It's our interior experience of it. So when I'm at home, I'm not really even thinking about perceiving the house, and as I move through the house, I'm more of in an interior mental space, right? And I'm focused on what I'm thinking about and what I'm doing. And the house is a sort of safe location for me to live and to inhabit. And so I think that in a lot of respects, it seems to me like our whole sense of home or our whole sense of a place is more mental really than in that place. It's all tied up in the memories of what happened in this room or what happened in this corner of the yard when I was, 10 versus when I was 8. What do I remember, And it's something that I don't often, I guess, think about, but watching relatives who are dealing with memory loss, it has been an issue where all of a sudden they don't recognize their home. They're in their home, but they don't recognize it as their home. And so that has been sort of a realization that it's actually the sense of home, I think, is more about, what we've collected and sort of assembled. And I think that that is essentially what happens with history or with our own sense of ourself is we've assembled this sort of, grouping of memories and data, and we sort of tie it into a narrative thread that makes sense and that we can tell, to ourselves to understand, I think, the world. And I'm rambling now, but that's essentially, I think, how the work that's in this show and that, I've been making lately does relate to the power of place. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Philip Haying, I worry I don't have the correct pronunciation of your last name.
Oh, thanks for asking. It's Haying.
Haying, thank you so much. Thank you. Philip Haying is a photographer based in Lawrence, Kansas. His work often focuses on the relationship between people and the environment. Born in Kansas City, he received his BFA in painting from KU. While at KU, he got to know the infamous William Burroughs and remained friends with him until his death in 1997. He began traveling after college. He went to Paris, France, and other places in France and Europe, and he had solo exhibitions in several venues. He later moved to New York, and he worked for the photographer Irving Penn, and he developed a robust career as a commercial and editorial photographer. In 2008, he moved back to Kansas, and he currently teaches photography at Johnson County Community College. His work has been shown in group and solo exhibitions around the world and can be found in the permanent collections of institutions such as the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art, the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, and the Cartier Foundation for Contemporary Art in Paris. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you all. So as I'm looking out here, I see lots of friends I know and all friends I don't know also. And thank you all for coming. So I'd like to start off with a question. Well, do any of you just wonder what's real? You know, it's kind of a very silly question, and it's a question that children ask, you know, what's real? Am I making this up? That question has stuck with me my whole life stubbornly. In my early adulthood, I learned of the philosophy of the Irish Bishop George Berkeley, who developed the philosophy of immaterialism, which is also called subjective idealism or solipsism, in that he posits that you can't ever verify reality. You can't ever know that it's not your senses tricking you into some kind of matrix perception of the world. And so everything is ideal and immaterial. I always had a bit of a problem with that because, I mean, of course, here we are, right? But nonetheless, I couldn't shake it. A few years ago, I came across this wonderful story. I'll just read this one quote from Boswell's Dr. Johnson. So the scene is that Boswell and Johnson come out of church and they start talking. After we came out, this is a direct quote from Boswell's book. After we came out of the church, we stood talking for some time together of Bishop Berkeley's ingenious sophistry to prove the non-existence of matter and that everything in the universe is merely ideal. I observed that though we are satisfied his doctrine is not true, it is impossible to refute it. I never shall forget the alacrity with which Johnson answered, striking his foot with mighty force against a large stone till he rebounded from it. I refute it thus, he said. So for me, photography is refuting it thus. It's a way of exploring the world, and through my understanding of the mechanism of it, and you know, both the machine and the optics and the chemistry and now the electronics and coding, you know, it's a way that I can sort of get outside of myself and deal with more information than I can hold in my own memory or my own catalog of note-taking, however I'm doing it. So for me, it presents the possibility of finding the paradoxical intersection of objective reality and subjective metaphorical interior experience. And by mythology, I mean the stories that we tell ourselves that help us navigate the world and find our way to a place. And then deal with that place and the people and the things in it at that time. And then I've also found that within photography, I can structure an image so that it has a kind of poetic organization of those facts. So on the one hand, there is the objective reality of, say, in that picture, that's definitely a stop sign in the middle of it. But then there's also the subjective impression of how the information is organized throughout the frame. If we can just go back 1 second. Throughout the frame, so the stop sign is more than a stop sign, it's a kind of urgent call to attention, to pay attention to environmental concerns. I've been concerned with the environment ever since when I was, 8 years old, I saw the photo on the cover of the National Geographic of the Earth from the moon. And, you know, I just remember thinking, this is finite, and there's all this stuff. And then, of course, the first time I saw the world from an airplane, I realized it's like, wow, we've really changed a lot of this. And just understanding how things work, you know, that the radical nature of that change, and seeing the place where I'm from the air, and from space, and then from the ground, all these different points of view, but especially seeing it, you know, made me concerned about the nature of those changes. And especially since 2008, my concern about the environmental crisis has been central to my work, one way or another, most often quite literally. The pictures in the show are concerned with that. That's a picture that's not in the show. That's our own wetlands when it was drained for the construction of the South Lawrence Trafficway a couple of years ago. If we can hold on this image for just a second. Speaking of not knowing what's real, the first time I saw this picture, I was on my way back from a photographic trip in eastern Colorado documenting the drought out there. And I was headed east on I-70 going about 80 miles an hour, and I was exhausted from the trip. It was about 105 degrees outside. And all of a sudden, this sign came up and swung by my head. And a couple of miles later, I realized, wait a minute, what did I just see? And a couple of miles after that, I said, I think I really saw that. And what it epitomizes is incredibly powerful. And it stuck with me so much that 3 days later, I jumped back in the car with a friend and drove back out there, west of Salina, the whole way wondering if I dreamed it up, right? And I really wasn't sure because it's just so outrageous and incredible, right? And went back and photographed it, and then lo and behold, it turns out it's a whole story of an artist who painted that sign to try to find a kidney for his wife who was dying. So it embodies so many different things, that particular picture, that I believe there's a kind of mythology about it, right? In my definition of mythology. I think this mythology that I'm talking about is something that we arrive at by fully participating and being aware of a place. Basically, you know, I have the belief or the faith that the universe is infinite. And so any small part or fraction of that infinity is still going to be infinite. And so whenever I'm really paying attention to where I am, and not paying attention, I'm trying to get my words straight, but actually observing what's going on all around me, the complexity of it becomes very kind of cosmic and spiritual. And by paying attention to all that complexity, I can kind of arrive at a mythological or poetic understanding of where we are, and that leads to a deeper experience of vitality and an aesthetic appreciation for what's there that I think is also ethical. These pictures of the flood are just from last Wednesday. I went up because I realized last Wednesday was vernal equinox, and a couple of hours after the beginning of spring, the supermoon rose over the river. And so it just seemed like a really apt moment for all of these interests to come together. And that's an example of how I kind of navigate my work in general and what I hope to depict and convey with it for all of you friends. So I think that pretty much sums it up. I want to say thanks again for being part of this exhibition. I went to school here. The classes that I attended and the time that I spent in this museum were powerfully formative, and to this day, I've been to museums all around the world, all of the most famous ones, and this is just a jewel, and it's really one of my favorite, and I think one of the best museums I've ever been to. The curation of it is just always stellar, and so it's a huge honor to be part of it and to share this moment with you all. So, thank you.
Thank you, Philip. Stephen Johnson is a multimedia artist whose work often forges connections between words, objects, and ideas. He earned a BFA from the University of Kansas in design and illustration, and a second BFA at KU in painting. He lived in New York City for about 10 years before moving back to Lawrence, which was his hometown. His 1995 picture book, Alphabet City, won the Caldecott Honor and was a New York Times Best Illustrated Book of the Year. He had a solo exhibition at this museum in 2008, some of you may have seen. His drawings and paintings can be found in the permanent collections of Carnegie Mellon University, the New Britain Museum of American Art, and the National Portrait Gallery at the Smithsonian. He has also created mosaic mural paintings in several key urban locations as part of international collaborations. Stephen Johnson.
I'm still dealing with what is real, Phil. And since you quoted a Johnson, what was it? I thrust the stone. What was that quote? I thrust it not. I refute it thus. You gotta kick the rock. Gotta kick the rock. Well, you know, St. Stephen was stoned to death. There's a whole got a whole kind of crazy thing. I'm gonna move on. But what is real, I think, is kind of great because it's what is we all deal, and you all deal with what is reality and what's on the wall. What have we seen? What have we transformed that? And before I go any further, Susan, thank you so much. And Sarah Lynn, both of you were so instrumental in my solo show in this space, which was really, well, prior to the transformation. But that leaves me just to quickly tell you a little bit about me, because I'm a confusing man and I'm still figuring myself out. I don't have a really good artist statement, but the best one came from my students at KU. And by the way, David and Brian, we're all on the 5th floor at KU, so we see each other. So this is really fun to see each other outside of that context. That's the sense of place over there. Luke is over there too, Marianne. And so there's a lot of friends. Anyway, so my students call me STJ, because Stephen Theodore Johnson. And so anyway, I use that as my sort of summing up. S stands for subject, T stands for transformation, and J stands for the joy I get in the process of making and the joy, hopefully, that people will receive by looking at the work. And that sort of sums me up. What's on the screen. So there's my show. Look at that. It's the abstract alphabet. Everything is based on language and alliteration. It's a children's book as well. So that mattress was designed specifically for this space. And some of you know Cotter and his parents right there, who helped me fabricate many of the pieces in the show. There's so much talent that goes on. I'd like to just say quickly that my sense of place is divided into 3, the power of 3. I'm totally obsessed with 3, 3 pyramids, it goes on and on. But my place here in Lawrence, Kansas, my place in New York City, and in France. Many of you know my parents, Ted and Mary Johnson. We lived periodically in Bordeaux, France, and that's where my sense of textures, layers, history, colors, and forms informed me. And so that I found that joy of the textures and sort of the environment that I enjoyed in France when I moved to New York City. So again, the fire escapes, the bridges, the sidewalks, everything was exciting. There's the number 13. From a book called City by Numbers, so it goes through 1 through 21, and it was published right before the 21st century. And, well, I can show you the books later, but I added the manhole covers to give it a sense of rhythm, sort of kind of a planet kind of thing, like the universe. And so we all use crosswalks, but I'm interested in pattern recognition, finding shapes, and just finding joy in the mundane areas of our world and our life. And just like Rick's beautiful photograph of just these moments where you don't expect it, but that's why I suppose we're in the show, huh, Rick? Yeah. So anyway, and I'm delighted just to, I don't know if there's a slide up there, but I just, returned from Germany, where there's a beautiful mosaic mural being installed in Lenexa. So you can come to the ribbon cutting in June 2nd, and they're an extraordinary company. It's called Meyer of Munich. You can Google them. They've done work all over the world, and it's a lovely opportunity to bring them to the Midwest, because they haven't done anything in Kansas City proper. And we've worked together on murals in New York and LA and in Dallas. And so there you go. And this is every letter of the alphabet, uppercase and lowercase, as well as images from my 3 children's books that deal with the alphabet, beautifully translated in small glass Smalties and big glass cakes. All of these are created in Mexico and in Italy, and it's just, I'm humbled by the craft. Angie and I, we got there and we were just blown away. And they're marvelous people to work with. So if you ever need a big mosaic mural or a small piece, check them out, and they're great. Anyway, thank you so much, and I think it's you, Rick.
Thank you. I don't know if there was a picture of an installed mural. There might have been one. Maybe it didn't show up, but
Maybe.
okay. Thank you. Oh, there it is.
That's,
Which one is that?
Universal City Metro stop in Los Angeles, and it has to deal with the movie industry. And again, it was made in Germany, in Munich. Beautiful tiles. They go far beyond what they're getting paid for this. In fact, the owner just told me they had 700 extra hours involved in making my current mural. And they had nice music going on too when they were working. And but it was it's just lovely, and it's a rare. Just as you might be interested in public art, it's a 1% for buildings, so 1% goes to the art. And in this case, we argued for more to cover the cost for this mural, which is really unheard of. So the city of Los Angeles coughed up some more money for that, and it goes up in sections. And then they build it in about 5 days. So it's pretty neat. The one in New York, so they start from the left. So you imagine all the people going down the subway during the day. They start putting up the mosaics, and they come in chunks. And then the people come back from work at the end of the day. They go, "Holy cow, how did you guys put this up so quickly?" Because they're thinking they're doing it one at a time, right? Well, no. And then they grout it at the end. So it's pretty neat. Oh, well, thank you, Susan, for that extra.
Thank you for adding that on. Rick Mitchell is an artist and writer who's based here in Lawrence, Kansas. He received a BFA in painting from KU and then an MFA at Rutgers University in New Jersey. He served for 18 years as a professor of photography at Rutgers, and he has also taught at KU, at Baker University, and other institutions. For 16 years, as someone mentioned, I think, he was the exhibition program director at the Lawrence Art Center, where he oversaw the development of over 240 exhibitions, and also there, in partnership with Paul Hutfed and Laurie Ward, he formed the Committee on Imagination and Place, which produced national conferences, organized dozens of events and exhibitions, and published books on themes related to place. He has received numerous awards and grants, including support for his interdisciplinary work from the National Endowment for the Arts, the National Science Foundation, National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Kansas Arts Commission, and a number of private foundations. Rick Mitchell.
Thank you very much. I want to, along with my fellow artists up here, thank everybody at the Spencer who has made this happen, and Susan, especially Sarah Lynn, and all the others. And I especially want to note Richard Clockey's work in hanging the show as somebody who organized 240 exhibitions and hung most of them. I have a special appreciation for those people who get up on the ladders and drive the nails and figure out where everything's supposed to go. Thank you for all of that. I had a great time at KU. I came to KU in 1967. I actually graduated high school here in Lawrence in the spring of '67, and immediately went to San Francisco for the Summer of Love in San Francisco. And came back here in September to start my studies at KU, but boy, was it hard to focus. And after one semester, I had a 0.065 grade point average. And I was asked to leave. And it was only because I was fortunate enough that my father was good friends with Dean Alderson at the time, that he had, and I had grown up in the same church as Dean Alderson. And he took mercy on me and allowed me to come back in for the second semester. And I was encouraged to focus, and I managed to somehow, and kind of pulled it out. So after the second semester was over, I was kind of back in. But I didn't really know what I was going to major in. I was interested in art, and I was interested in writing, and I thought I might become a journalist or maybe even a novelist. But I enjoyed drawing, and I had been fortunate enough to get some encouragement for the artwork I'd done in high school, and so I was taking classes in drawing too. But it was in 1967, the University of Kansas Art Department was really an interesting place. And it was beginning to grow. You know, the baby boomer increase in university enrollments was really up, and all the departments were growing, and the art department was just like that. And there were some older faculty members who were just about ready to retire, and then there was this whole huge group of new faculty members in their 20s, and maybe early 30s, which seemed kind of old to me, but they all came at the same time. And I ended up taking some classes with some of these guys, and they were all guys at that point. I think there was maybe one female faculty member in the painting department at that point in time. And I had just such interesting conversations with them, and they were having fun. It seemed to me they were having more fun than anybody. And so I just ended up taking more classes and becoming a painting major, and I did that, and I graduated and so forth, and really decided that I was going to be an artist. But it was really those conversations, probably in my sophomore year, with people like Bob Price, and I was in Roger Shimamura's very first drawing class, and Mike Ott, some of you may have known Mike, and Peter Thompson, and those people have become lifelong friends as well. So that's what got me started. Then I went to Rutgers, and I got a degree, a master's degree, and I became involved in, the work that I did was not really painting, and I was really building environments. This is what we called them when I was an undergraduate student here. It was a kind of installation work, and when I got to Rutgers, there were a whole lot of people at Rutgers who were doing that kind of work, and I became connected with a group of Fluxus artists, and became Bob Watts. He was a well-known Fluxus artist. Do you know about Fluxus artists? Some of you will and some of you won't. It's kind of an offshoot of surrealism, so forth. Anyway, I got involved with that. And all these the thing about that is I was always taking one step out of traditional art making. I was always taking another step out of that. And I became involved with other kinds of organizations that were environmental as well. As a graduate student, I got my first job as a photographer, which was working for an archaeological survey unit in New York City. And that took me up in airplanes photographing, and I learned a whole lot about studio work. You know, you'd be up in an airplane photographing sites one day, and the next day you'd be photographing pipe stems and arrowheads and things like that during close-up photography. So I kind of learned about doing that kind of thing. It was a good education that way. But what happened to me over a period of time, to kind of make a very, very long story short, is I became very interdisciplinary in my approach. And I did not have a straight path in the arts. I always had my hand in the arts, but I also worked very much with scientists the whole way. At one point at Rutgers, I went to Panama with a group of scientists to document erosion in the Panama watershed around the Panama Canal. And this was strictly for scientific purposes. But again, it put me up in the airplane. It put me in a very interesting environment, and I worked as a photographer in that connection. And I was always just very interested in the interdisciplinary work that came along with that. And I loved working with scientists. I loved working with humanities people. I loved working with artists. And I just kept on doing that. The work that's in this show, I have a couple of photographs in the show, and they're about really come out of a thread of my work that's always been there, which is I go walking with my camera. And it's meditative work. And even though I was, doing commercial work and I was doing scientific work and so forth with photography, I always had this little place that was about discovery, and it was about moving around with the camera and using it as a way to look, and as an excuse to look, as a way of discovery. And it was mentioned that we started a few years ago the Committee on Imagination and Place, and we had a conference. The very first conference we did was called Hypnogeography. And that was a conference that was really based on the idea of dreams of place. And that if you could record the dreams that people had of place, you'd have a fuller geography, a fuller record of that place. And that really fit right in with kind of the way I work in my photography. And the other day I was thinking about this, and I mentioned that a walk with my camera is a lot like a lucid dream. And it's a very private thing that I do. And if you've ever been able to do lucid dreaming or had the experience of lucid dreaming, then you know how absorbing it can be and what a great sense of empowerment there can be in lucid dreaming. And I feel that same kind of empowerment when I go walking with my camera, as I go into interior space and I just let myself respond to things. And so the work that's here is really work that came out of that kind of thing, not related to any kind of commercial purpose or anything of that kind, or even any particular ambition in the way of art making. It's just what I do when I want to go out and have that kind of experience. So I'll stop there.
Hello, everyone. I'm David Cateforis, the chair of the Art History Department, partnering with Susan Earle to help to moderate this program. I would like to give you all a small gift. Everybody stand up and stretch. Don't start chatting, just stand up and stretch. So we will try and do this efficiently. Thank you, all of you, Stephen, Rick, Brian, Philip, Lisa, Marcie, David, for your insights, for sharing with us anecdotes and thoughts, observations. I was furiously taking notes to try and pull out some of the themes that I heard weaving through some of your comments. Stephen, I have a very specific question for you that isn't really like a discussion question, it's just a factual question. Your two works on paper in this show, the letter N and the number 13, which are highly realistic works in a variety of graphic media. Are those based on photographs?
They are. So,
Microphone.
oh yeah,
Oh, that one's already on, the one with the cord.
Oh, hey. Okay, yeah. Just very quickly. So it was walking around New York City. Just a quick lead up to that. I did a lot of children's books in New York. Wasn't going anywhere. I asked Tom Allen, who used to teach here at KU, how much he was getting paid for children's books. It blew my mind what he was getting. I said, I got to do one more round at this. Not that I got that one. So I went up to Viking Books and I pitched, coincidentally, this book about an alphabet where I walk it around. I'm going to make some paintings of an alphabet. And I got a contract on the spot. I said, let me think about it in my hubristic young kind of attitude, right? So I get down 5 minutes later to the subway and try to get a payphone. I call back, I'll do it. And so that was the first time I ever painted anything as realistic as that. So yes, I took photographs which weren't very good, and I'd go to 1 hour photo, remember the 1 hour photos, and then they'd print them out, and they were terrible. But the reason why they're paintings, because I'm not a photographer, but I'm a painter, and they needed to go through me, so I needed to get rid of cigarette butts and change skies and organize things like that. And every one was sort of a new joy for me. And they're created in pastels and watercolors, a weird technique where I actually end up painting the pastel, so it packs it down and makes kind of a gouache substance, but the velvety quality of a pastel is just non-negotiable. It gets the vibrancy and so forth. So,
thank you, that's great. So there's a commonality between you seven, despite the diversity of your work, is its relationship to photography. Obviously, several of you, your principal medium, Philip, your principal medium is photography. Rick, Brian works in a lot of photography, Philip. But it turns out, and Lisa, I don't think you actually mentioned this, but photography is important to your work. Marcie, you talked a lot about this turn in your work towards a relationship to photography. We know, David, that you use your own photographs as the basis of the central imagery of your weavings. Have I left anyone out? So, and it turns out that Stephen is working from photographic sources there. So I don't know that we necessarily want to talk about photography specifically, but maybe let's talk about the way in which photography or other sort of mechanisms are feeding your response to place, or the way that you are gathering information or stimuli, channeling it into your art. It seems that it turns out that photography is important to all of you to some degree. So maybe the conversation could be not specifically about photography, but about, maybe I like the word that Stephen used, about transformation. So think about sort of photography as a kind of a model for a way that we receive information, and then what sort of transformation goes on in your art. Maybe that's a better way to, sort of thinking through this, a better way to ask the question, if that makes sense.
Is it to me?
Yeah, you're to my left, so go.
Okay. That's a very interesting question. I think for me, I mean, in taking the photographs, it's the experience of documenting the space. It's about the memories that I want to keep. But I think in my artwork, it's become kind of a love of the math and science and computers, and I can take the photographs to the computer, and then I can inhabit that space and alter it. I can take a photo from Paris and put the background from Ireland, and I can sort of envision new spaces by the way I can transform them through the computer.
Well, I'm not sure that I have anything too different to say than what I had previously mentioned, because when I took a lot of those photographs when I was traveling, it was just my kind of immediate response to that place. And I really did not intend on using images necessarily in my work, but they were so evocative for me that I used them, I think, as a way of pulling up those memories and sources to suggest aspects of making with the three-dimensional work in the materiality of it, so it's because it was working with images was so different, and I know I'm not supposed to talk about photography, so, but I think it was kind of, for me, it was a way of kind of understanding a moment and translating that moment in a new way. And the fact that I don't really consider myself a photographer, that kind of gave me a permission to deal with those images in a different way, I think, too. Oh, sorry.
I'll just say two things quickly. The print panels emerged out of my desire to put the river in motion. So when I was flying over the length of the river, you know, sweeping back and forth, I mean, like, you're not stopping, you're in a plane, so, and I'm just shooting madly, and I'm not a photographer either. But I've taken hundreds of photos, probably 1,000 by now, of the river. And I also took video. My first few flights, it's hard to hold both cameras at the same time, and I just wanted to capture as much as I could while I was flying. So the print panels were kind of my way to kind of show those sequences, and it kind of mimics the frame-by-frame nature of all of my footage that I referred to for the woodcuts. And then also, in my first couple shows anyway, I used my video. I would play my video in the studio and kind of plein air paint from it. I'd pause, and I'd do little oil sketches of the river by pausing and rewinding my video, because I consider myself primarily a plein air painter. I like to be, you know, fluid and spontaneous and that. So that was another way I used photography.
I studied painting here at KU, and I love painting. Making paintings myself drives me absolutely crazy because it's just so wide open. There's no pushback, right? When I was in residency at the Cartier Foundation, I was commissioned to build their darkroom, and so I built the darkroom, and they had a lot of money, and I built a beautiful darkroom for them, and got it up and got it running, and printed my work that I did for the commission there. And then they said, well, we've got another artist coming in who wants to use the darkroom. And I'm like, okay, great. And they said, can you show him around? And so sure enough, and I forget his name now, it's probably better that I did. Marcus was his first name, but he came in and was looking around, and I was showing it to him, and I said, well, since you're a photographer, you'll appreciate this. And he said, he'd grown up in England, so he had an English accent, and he said to me, I'm not a photographer, mate. I'm an artist who uses photography. Well, I'm a photographer who uses art.
Sorry. Yeah, I'm also come to photography in a sort of roundabout way and started taking photographs because it was the only way to animate something that I had drawn, I guess, other than making a flip book. And so it came out of a necessity, I think, of a medium that I wanted to work in, and which involved time. And then it just continues to grow. I mean, you know, the camera is a friend. You can go on a walk and it changes your walk. I mean, if you go on a walk without the camera, it's a very different sort of experience. And I think that in some respects, you know, it also allows us to produce images that can then be shared immediately and in so many different ways in the world today that I think it's just an important media. And so whether you're using it, you know, as a means to an end or as the end itself, like there's so much flexibility within the medium of photography that I think is just, you know, calls to all of us, you know, if we're interested in making images at this point.
When I was in graduate school, I was doing, as I said, kind of performance art, environmental art, conceptual art, but the whole ideal was to try to convey an idea with the least amount of stuff, material stuff. And, you know, there were people like Yoko Ono who would put up little notes on the gallery wall, you know, that would give you the idea. It would promote the idea with really no craft, no art making in a traditional sense at all. And I was into that, and I was thinking that that was where I wanted to go. You know, the less, there was too much stuff in the world, there was too much of everything, so let's just get right to the idea and do it that way. So that was my ideal. But after graduate school, it began to dawn on me that I didn't know how to do anything. And that I was going to have to make a living somehow. And I knew something about photography because I learned how to do photography to document the performance work that I was doing and that kind of thing. So I had some rudimentary skills. But then I just got very involved in learning the craft. And then, you know, I got a hold of a technical history of photography by a guy named Joseph Ader, who was a European, who wrote, it's a book about this thick, about all of the inventions, chemistry, physics, so forth of photography, and that was my Bible for a couple of years, and took some other classes, took workshops, things like that, and eventually just got more into photography. But I kind of relate to, I'm an artist who uses photography. I admit to that. I kind of relate to that. And in the pictures here, you know, what I do now, what's important for me to do now is not to do documentary photography, but to do a heightened reality. And I do that, I mean, there's a lot of tools you can use to do that. And so heightening reality just enough, but not too much to make something seem artificial or overly manipulated, but just enough to get a little heightened perception.
I'll be very quick because I know we're running out of time. I think all of this photography and all of us is about memory, and it's a documentation, it's an experience. Lisa's painting from video, but it's really her memory of it in the plane, you know what I mean? And I painted with Lisa in plein air, it's marvelous. And memory of this museum. So when we come to the Spencer, we view all these works, and then we question. I think the questioning is a great kind of conversation opening, and we leave with a question. Wow, what did that mean? How did that transform me? And the memory of that experience in the museum, and then we come back and we look at a new piece, or we just study one piece, you know. It's fun to go to a museum and just obsess about a frame, you know, and then forget the image. Try that at the Met. I've done that. It's great. You find cobwebs in the frames. It's unbelievable. But you really admire that kind of memory, and I'll never forget it. So there you go.
Sorry. I've been thinking about my working with photographs. The actual piece is a long distance away from the photo that I take. And when you take a photograph, it's an abstraction of the world. And then I take it into Photoshop and it gets abstracted again. And then I weave it and it gets abstracted again. And in a sense, it's kind of like I'm trying to preserve these memories, but they're deteriorating as I'm working with them.
Thank you. And Stephen, you mentioned memory, which was another thread that ran through a lot of your comments, so we maybe don't need to revisit it now. But another thing that some of you mentioned was the idea of inner experience or interior experience or subjective experience. And maybe you could say a few words about the degree to which you feel like your inner experience is actually communicated to the viewer who doesn't have access to your thoughts or to your stories. And how important is it for the viewer to know that? I mean, let me just give a couple of concrete examples. Philip, the whole story behind the billboard, "I Need a Kidney." I mean, there's an anecdote there that I would argue, once we have access to it, we can share some of your experience that otherwise would be missing. Or Marcie, I mean, the steps that we have to take to get from your moss green felt to the trees behind that wall in Berlin. I mean, again, it seems to me that that's a kind of inner experience, and as an art historian, I want to know, what the artist experienced and is seeking to convey through the work. But my question to you as artists is, to what degree are you thinking about the other side of this transaction? To what degree are you thinking about the viewer's experience? To what degree are you trying to convey something to the viewer that is a kind of communication of your experience, or is it more just, I have to make this work, and then we'll see what happens when it goes out into the world? I hope that question makes sense and resonates with you.
This is something it's sort of my own personal belief, but I often talk to students about this, that I think there are a group of artists that make work specifically to communicate to their audience, and there are another group that make work to explain things for themselves and allow the audience to witness what they've been doing. And I'm sort of in the latter group, that a lot of the images in my work I don't talk about specifically, and there are a lot of things hidden there that if people ask, I will tell them, but that it's for my benefit alone. So I am sort of hoping the audience likes looking at what I'm doing, but it's really more for me.
I think I fall in both camps, actually. And it really depends on what I'm working on and when and where and what it's motivated it, that work. For example, this piece, at one point I considered exhibiting the photograph with this work. So you could really see the source of that inspiration and source that, but I realized kind of part of the way through it that it was really about the physicality of this plane and how that I wanted it to remain fairly abstract, but I could offer suggestions really subtly through the titles. And so I do that, I think, a lot in my work. And it really depends on the subject matter and the body of work, how much I want to communicate to people and for them to kind of understand. And then, but also I really believe that, work operates on different levels. Hopefully successful work operates on different level, from a very kind of visceral experience and intellectual experience and sort of with technical aspects too. So, all those things fit together in different ways with each piece for me. Oh, sorry.
Each piece is obviously a composite of many things, but primarily for me it's the firsthand experience of the place and then the memory of it. So for example, this piece, when I'm carving out a sandbar in paint, I'm viscerally feeling myself on the river, paddling by it or getting stuck on it perhaps. I'm thinking about the way the current goes and how the bends are carved out, all that. I don't think wouldn't feel authentic to me if I just took a photo of it. from the air, whatever, and painted without having all the firsthand experience of knowing what the sand feels like, knowing what the water feels like. I mean, every aspect of every time I've been in contact with the river or, you know, the sandbars or whatever, it's a lot of memory involved in it, so.
There are stories that go along with my pictures that have certain kind of events, like the one I told. You know, some of them have more or less interesting stories. But in terms of like, you know, like communicating my internal world to any of you friends out there, no. No. It's not pretty and it's not interesting. And you know, one of the things I love about photography is that it takes me out of that. And you know, I do kind of have a different experience of yours in that, for me, photography is very much like what you describe of painting. Like when I'm working up a file after I've shot it, I'm very much in contact with the circumstances of that. In fact, I really try desperately to communicate the direct experience of what, you know, the temperature of the air was, what it sounded like, the consistency of the soil or whatever it is, you know, just like really try to get the photograph to evoke that as potently as possible and to get my, you know, uninteresting internal life out of the way as much as possible.
I think with the work that I am exhibiting here, no, I don't particularly have the audience in mind and want to convey something of the interior experience that I'm having, or the details, right, of who those people are that were visiting my studio in the animation. They are real people. Like, that space is and was that way, and yet it's not a video, it's an animation. So, I mean, everything's a little bit different and edited. And I think that as artists, we have to expect that people who engage with our work are going to bring their own, you know, lives with them into the museum or into wherever they encounter our work. And it doesn't seem that important to me to spell everything out, you know? Like, I feel like if somebody has an experience that is meaningful to them, then that's great, you know? Like, that's the best possible outcome for engaging with any work of art, is to have a meaningful experience. But I don't know, it doesn't seem really that useful, I guess, in my...
Brian, would you say that if it's meaningful enough to you as the creator, hopefully it will be meaningful to the viewer? Is that the formula?
That's kind of what I'm struggling to say, is that, like, there are pieces of art or music, I think, is maybe a more solid example of this, that often like wordless music, where something clearly is behind this, and I connect to it on a very visceral level, but I don't know, you know, what it was, what were those initial impulses that triggered someone to make these decisions. It doesn't really matter, because ultimately I'm engaged with it, and I think, you know, it becomes more intriguing in some respects too. Whenever you're so, like, it makes you realize how divorced we are from one another, our interior experiences. So, I don't know, that's how I think about it.
David, your question made me think of two things. Really early on, I was fortunate to be in an advanced photographic seminar that was done by Frederick Sommer at Princeton in 1979. And he was a photographer. You know his work at all. He didn't make a lot of work, but everything that he made advanced what he could do in some interesting way, technically. And he was kind of a surrealistic artist too, so there were ideas as well, and interpretation. But what it made me think of is, I don't really need to make a lot of work. I don't need to come at it obsessively. I don't need to be all nervously. I don't need to do it that way. I just need to make work that advances the work every time I do something. What am I advancing? And that's really for me, that's not for an outside viewer. But on the other hand, when I put work out there, I kind of, when I make the work, I kind of know it when I see it. If I have done something that moves me in some way, that feels right, like I got it, then I feel good about putting it on the wall, thinking that maybe somebody else might get it too.
I think what Rick just said is the I got it. I think we all might share the same feeling as, you know, we got it, we didn't get it in terms of the thing, and I'll just be brief. But most of my work is very to be seen. I mean, I write and illustrate children's books, so that's meant to be communicated very, very clearly. And then I do public art, so it has to be very clear in that. I like the trying to create work, particularly in public art, that will satisfy children, art critics, and grandparents, and people of all nationalities, and not offend anybody, and make them see the world a little bit differently. You might go to check out my website for the one I did in Love Field, Dallas, but it's a quick narrative, and it sums up things, I think, in a way that proves my point. However, now just quickly, I have been involved with doing my own personal abstract and collage, and I'm trying to dig deeper and do work that has no business being seen, and in this kind of crazy relief to do that, because everything I do needs to have a purpose, and that's the way I trained here at KU. I went, and Sima Katz is sitting in the audience. She told me some great stuff when I was in her lithography class. She said, "Stephen, if you don't have any ideas, you're just a guy that can draw." And I'm like, oh my God. And you know, and then she said something else great. She goes, I got all these ideas, but no time. And I was, you know, I had all this time and no ideas. And so, so now I'm, you know, where Sima is, and it's a problem, but it's a good problem. Anyway, there you go.
The reason I became a professor is I wanted to stay in school and keep learning. And something I've learned this evening is that when you have 7 very thoughtful and articulate artists, time flies. And so, although I promised you that I would open the room up to questions from the audience, I think instead what I will do is ask the artists to linger up here for several more minutes and ask you to come up individually and speak with them, ask your questions in that way, because we're already past 7 o'clock and some of you may need to leave. But please do, if you can, stay, come up and talk with the artists, talk with me and Susan. Let's give them a big round of applause, and thank you.